I stood in my father's office, my hands trembling slightly as he paced behind his mahogany desk. The family business logo, Wilson Manufacturing, cast a shadow on the wall behind him, a constant reminder of the legacy I was supposedly failing to uphold. "Look at these numbers, Sarah," he snapped, slapping down the quarterly report. "Down 15% under your management. Your grandfather built this company from nothing, and you're destroying it in months." I tried to keep my voice steady. "Dad, if you'd just listen to my proposal about modernizing our—" "Enough." He cut me off, his face reddening. "Your brother James was right. You're too weak, too soft for this business. All these new ideas, digital transformations, that's not how we do things here." My mother sat quietly in the corner, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her designer handbag. She wouldn't meet my eyes, she never did when Dad was in one of his moods. "But the market is changing," I argued. "If we don't adapt." I said enough. Dad slammed his hand on the desk. "You've had your chance. 6 months as regional director, and all you've done is push for changes we don't need. James will take over your position effective immediately." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. James, my younger brother who spent more time playing golf than working, who'd never even bothered to learn our inventory system. "That James. You can't be serious," I whispered. Mom finally spoke up, her voice soft but firm. "Your father knows best, Sarah. Maybe this is a sign you should explore other opportunities." I looked between them, my father red-faced and rigid with anger, and my mother, perfectly composed as always, more concerned with appearances than actual business sense. 28 years old with an MBA from Harvard and 5 years of experience at top consulting firms, and they still saw me as the little girl who wasn't tough enough to follow in my grandfather's footsteps. "Fine," I said, my voice ice cold. "I quit." Dad scoffed. "You can't quit. You're fired." I took off my company ID and placed it carefully on his desk. "You'll regret this," I said quietly. "Are you threatening me?" Dad's voice rose dangerously. "No," I replied, gathering my dignity. "I'm making a promise." As I walked out of that office, I could hear my mother calling after me, "Sarah, don't be dramatic. Come back here." But I didn't look back. I had worked at Wilson Manufacturing since I was 16, starting in the warehouse, learning every aspect of the business. I knew our suppliers, our customers, our strengths, and most importantly, our weaknesses. I also knew something my father didn't. The company was in more trouble than just a 15% quarterly drop. In my office, I quickly downloaded key files onto my personal drive. Nothing confidential, just market research and customer feedback I'd gathered over the past 6 months. James might be taking my position, but my work was coming with me. As I packed my personal items into a box, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus, our chief financial officer and one of the few people who supported my modernization plans. "Just heard. They're making a huge mistake. Call me when you can." I smiled slightly. Dad had no idea what he'd just set in motion. His outdated management style and resistance to change weren't just costing us market share, they were driving away our best talent. Marcus wasn't the only one who saw it. Walking through the warehouse for the last time, I stopped to say goodbye to the workers I'd gotten to know over the years. Many looked shocked, some angry on my behalf. "Don't worry about me," I told them. "Sometimes the best thing that can happen is getting pushed out of your comfort zone." Outside, I placed my box in my car and took one last look at the building. Wilson Manufacturing had been my whole life, my inheritance, my future. Now it was just another company making the fatal mistake of clinging to the past. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I'd been saving for a special occasion. "Hello, Michael. It's Sarah Wilson. Remember that investment opportunity we discussed? I'm ready to talk details." The next 6 months would change everything. Dad thought he was protecting his precious company from my progressive ideas. Instead, he'd just given me the push I needed to become his worst nightmare. Not just a competitor, but a threat he never saw coming. Little did they know being fired was just the beginning of my story. The real shock would come when they discovered exactly what I was capable of doing on my own. 6 months later, I sat in my sleek downtown office, reviewing the final documents. The view of the city skyline was a far cry from my old workspace at Wilson Manufacturing, but that wasn't the only thing that had changed. "The numbers look good," Michael said, sliding another contract across my desk. "Your father has no idea how bad things have gotten at Wilson. Their major clients are jumping ship and James. He chuckled. Well, let's just say golf skills don't translate to business acumen. I smiled, remembering how quickly everything had fallen into place after that fateful day. Michael, a venture capitalist I'd met at a business conference, had been eager to back my new company NextGen Manufacturing Solutions. We'd spent the past 6 months poaching top talent from Wilson and other competitors, implementing the very same modernization strategies my father had rejected. My phone buzzed, a text from Marcus, who'd resigned from Wilson 3 months ago to join me as CFO. Your brother just lost the Anderson account. Your father's having a meltdown. I wasn't surprised. The Anderson account had been with Wilson for 20 years. I'd personally handled their business for the past 3, which was why they'd followed me to NextGen without hesitation. Sarah. Michael leaned forward, his expression serious. Wilson Manufacturing's stock has dropped 40% since you left. They're vulnerable. If we move now. I nodded, pulling up the presentation on my laptop. The hostile takeover proposal is ready. We've acquired enough shares through shell companies over the past few months. One more push and we'll have controlling interest. Just then my assistant Emma knocked and entered. Ms. Wilson, your mother's been calling the office. She says it's urgent. Of course it was. Mom always thought everything was urgent. I hadn't spoken to my parents since that day, though I'd heard plenty through the grapevine. Dad's temper had gotten worse as the company struggled. James was in over his head and their best employees were leaving in droves. Tell her I'm in a meeting, I replied. Actually, tell her I'll see them all very soon. Emma nodded, trying to hide her smile. Everyone in the office knew what was coming. The next week passed in a blur of meetings and legal documents. Finally, everything was in place. Wilson Manufacturing was calling an emergency shareholders meeting to address the company's declining performance. As the new majority shareholder, though they didn't know it yet, I had a front-row seat to what would become the most dramatic family reunion in corporate history. The morning of the meeting, I stood in front of my full-length mirror, adjusting my designer suit. Gone was the timid daughter trying to please her father. In her place stood a CEO who'd built a successful company from scratch in 6 months. Ready? Marcus asked, waiting by my office door. I grabbed my briefcase containing the takeover documents. Time to show them exactly how weak I am. We arrived at Wilson Manufacturing early. Through the glass doors I could see the shareholders gathering in the main conference room. Dad sat at the head of the table, trying to maintain his usual authoritative presence but looking notably strained. Mom sat beside him, perfectly coiffed as always but with worry lines around her eyes. James was there too, fumbling with his presentation notes. Your brother looks like he's about to be sick, Marcus whispered. Wait until he sees what's coming, I replied. At exactly 9 a.m. the meeting was called to order. I stood in the hallway, listening as Dad tried to explain away the company's failures, blaming market conditions, foreign competition, everything except his own poor leadership. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. The chairman announced, and now we must address the elephant in the room. A significant portion of company shares has been acquired by a new entity over the past 6 months. The new majority shareholder is here today to discuss the future of Wilson Manufacturing. I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, my father's angry demand to know who dared to try and take his company. James was stuttering something about legal actions. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the conference room doors and walked in. The room fell silent. Mom's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, spilling across the polished table. Dad's face went from red to white in seconds. James looked like he might actually faint. I walked to the front of the room, placed my briefcase on the table and smiled. Shall we begin? This is impossible, Dad sputtered, half rising from his chair. You can't. You don't have the resources to. Actually, I said, opening my briefcase and distributing documents to the board members. I do. NextGen Manufacturing Solutions, my company, now owns 51% of Wilson Manufacturing shares. And this, I held up another document, is our proposal for complete acquisition. Mom was dabbing at the spilled coffee with trembling hands, her perfect composure finally cracking. Sarah, darling, surely we can discuss this as a family. Family. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. We stopped being a family the day you sat silently while Dad threw me out of my own inheritance. When you chose James, who couldn't tell a balance sheet from a birthday card, to run this company instead of me. James stood up, his face red. Now wait just a minute. Quarterly profits down 60%. I cut him off, clicking through my presentation. 8 major clients lost. 32 key employees resigned. And, I paused for effect, 3 pending lawsuits from customers due to quality control issues. Did I miss anything, James? Or were you too busy working on your golf swing to notice the company was sinking? The board members were whispering among themselves, reviewing the documents I'd provided. I could see the realization dawning on their faces. Wilson Manufacturing was no longer the powerhouse it had been. This is outrageous. Dad slammed his fist on the table. I built this company. No, I interrupted, my voice sharp. Grandfather built this company. You inherited it just like you planned to hand it to James. The difference is I earned my place here. I clicked to the next slide, showing NextGen's impressive growth charts. While you were clinging to outdated methods, I built a modern, efficient company. We've doubled our market share in 6 months. Our digital infrastructure cuts costs by 40%. And those clients you lost. I smiled. They're all with us now. The board members were nodding. They could see the numbers didn't lie. You can't do this to your own father, Mom pleaded. Watch me, I replied. I'm offering a fair price for the remaining shares, well above market value. The alternative is watching Wilson Manufacturing become completely obsolete within a year. Dad slumped in his chair, suddenly looking old. Why? He asked quietly. Why not just build your own success? Why come back to destroy what I built? I walked over to him, placing my hands on the table and leaning forward. Because you needed to learn that being a woman doesn't make me weak. That your daughter could be just as capable, no more capable than your precious son. Consider this a very expensive business lesson. The vote was quick and decisive. The board approved the acquisition almost unanimously. As the meeting adjourned, I watched my father sign the final documents, his hand shaking slightly. The Wilson name stays, I told him as he stood to leave. But everything else changes. Starting tomorrow. He nodded stiffly, not meeting my eyes. Mom tried to hug me, but I stepped back. James had already slunk out of the room, probably heading straight to the golf course. Later that evening, I stood in what had been my father's office, my office now. The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the floor. Marcus knocked and entered, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. Congratulations, so, he said, handing me a glass. I took it, looking around the office. You know what the funny thing is? Dad always said I was too soft for business. But he never understood, true strength isn't about being tough. It's about being smart, adaptable, and willing to change. To change, Marcus raised his glass. And to karma, I added with a smile. The next morning, a moving company arrived to clear out the old office furniture. Everything was getting an upgrade, new technology, new systems, new leadership. As I watched them work, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Your father would like to talk. Maybe over dinner.